Picture this scene. It's May 10th, 1940, and Britain stands utterly alone against the most powerful military machine the world has ever witnessed. France is collapsing, Belgium has fallen, and Nazi jackboots are marching toward the English Channel. In London, a 65-year-old man with a cigar clenched between his teeth has just become Prime Minister of a nation that many believe is about to be crushed into submission. That man is Winston Churchill, and what happens next will determine whether democracy itself survives or perishes from the earth. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this moment in history. Churchill wasn't the popular choice. He wasn't even the safe choice. In fact, most of his own Conservative Party colleagues despised him, the Labour Party barely tolerated him, and King George VI was downright skeptical of his appointment. The House of Lords fell completely silent when they learned he would be Prime Minister. This was a man who had been politically exiled for decades, whose reputation was in tatters, and whose warnings about Hitler had been dismissed as the ravings of a warmonger. So why does this matter today? Because what Churchill did in the months that followed represents perhaps the greatest example of leadership under impossible pressure in modern history. This isn't just another World War II story. This is about how one person's unshakable determination, masterful communication, and absolute refusal to surrender transformed not just Britain's fate, but the entire course of human civilization. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Churchill pulled off what historians call a miracle of leadership, turning Britain's darkest hour into its finest hour. But first, we need to grasp just how catastrophically bad things were when Churchill took power. The date was May 10th, 1940, and it wasn't just any ordinary day. As Churchill later wrote in his memoirs, "I felt that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." And what a trial it was. On the exact same morning that Churchill finally achieved his life's ambition to become Prime Minister, German tanks were smashing through the Ardennes forest, launching the most devastating military offensive in European history. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France were all under attack simultaneously. The German war machine that had already conquered Poland, Denmark, and Norway was now turning its full fury toward Western Europe. Within just 6 weeks, the unthinkable happened. France, the mighty French Republic, with its supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, collapsed completely. The French government fled Paris. The German army was goose-stepping down the Champs-Élysées. From Poland to the Atlantic Ocean, from Norway to the Pyrenees, Nazi flags were flying over almost the entire continent of Europe. Britain was now facing something it hadn't confronted for over 1,000 years since the Norman conquest: total invasion by a foreign power. And this wasn't just any foreign power. This was Nazi Germany, at the absolute peak of its military might, commanded by generals who had perfected the art of blitzkrieg warfare, backed by the most advanced air force in the world, and led by a dictator who had already proven he would stop at nothing to achieve total domination. But here's where the story gets even more incredible. Churchill's own political position was incredibly fragile. Labour politician Hugh Dalton described him as the only man we have for this hour. But that wasn't because Churchill was popular. It was because literally nobody else wanted the job. Conservative Party leaders preferred Lord Halifax, but Halifax himself declined, sensing it wasn't his moment. Neville Chamberlain, the outgoing Prime Minister who had tried desperately to appease Hitler, chose Churchill not because he believed in him, but because Churchill was the only person the opposition would accept as leader of a national unity government. Think about the psychology of this moment. Churchill had been warning about the Nazi threat for years, while most politicians were calling him a warmonger and an alarmist. He had been in the political wilderness, writing books and giving speeches to largely empty chambers. His previous major military involvement, the disastrous Dardanelles campaign in World War I, had ended in catastrophic failure. Many people saw him as a relic from a bygone era, a man whose time had passed. Yet, on May 10th, 1940, this supposedly washed-up politician inherited the leadership of a nation whose very survival was hanging by a thread. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped in France. The Royal Navy, while still powerful, was vastly outnumbered by the combined German and Italian fleets. The Royal Air Force was modern but small compared to the Luftwaffe. Britain's army was brave but woefully under-equipped compared to the Wehrmacht. And then came Dunkirk. The evacuation that would become legendary actually began as what Churchill himself called a colossal military disaster. The entire core of the British Army, over 300,000 men, were trapped on the beaches of northern France, with the German army closing in for what should have been the kill shot that would end Britain's ability to continue fighting. Military experts, including Churchill's own advisors, expected that maybe 20,000 to 30,000 men could be rescued before the Germans overran the beaches. But something extraordinary happened. Through a combination of careful planning, incredible courage, and what many called divine intervention, Operation Dynamo succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers, including 120,000 French troops, were evacuated from Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th. Every type of vessel that could float made the dangerous journey across the English Channel. Royal Navy destroyers worked alongside fishing boats, pleasure craft, and even paddle steamers in what known as the became miracle of deliverance. However, Churchill understood something that many people missed. Dunkirk was not a victory. It was a rescue operation that prevented total catastrophe. But Britain had still lost all of its heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, and supplies. The British Army was now back on British soil, but it was essentially naked, without the weapons needed to repel a German invasion. This is where Churchill's genius as a communicator became absolutely crucial. On June 4th, 1940, he delivered one of the most famous speeches in the English language to the House of Commons. But here's what's fascinating about this speech. Churchill didn't try to spin Dunkirk as a great victory. Instead, he told the brutal truth about Britain's situation, while simultaneously defying anyone to suggest that Britain should surrender. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory, Churchill warned Parliament. Wars are not won by evacuations. He was absolutely honest about the military disaster that had occurred. The whole root and core and brain of the British Army had been stranded and nearly captured or destroyed. France was collapsing. Britain was now standing alone against the Nazi Empire. But then came the words that would echo through history and define British resolve for generations. "We shall go on to the end," Churchill declared. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." What made these words so powerful wasn't just their defiant tone. It was Churchill's absolute authenticity. This wasn't political theatre or empty rhetoric. This was a man who genuinely believed that Britain could and would survive, even when almost every rational analysis suggested otherwise. Churchill wasn't just trying to boost morale. He was stating what he saw as an unshakable truth about the British character and democratic values. But here's something most people don't know about this famous speech. It wasn't originally broadcast to the British public. Only members of Parliament heard Churchill deliver those iconic words in person that day. The speech was primarily aimed not at British civilians, but at American political leaders who were still watching the war from the sidelines. Churchill understood that Britain's ultimate survival might depend on American support, and he needed to convince President Franklin Roosevelt that Britain would continue fighting even if invaded, rather than surrender its fleet to the Germans. This strategic calculation reveals the sophisticated mind behind Churchill's public persona. While he was projecting unshakable British resolve to his own people, he was simultaneously conducting delicate diplomacy with America. President Roosevelt had sent secret messages through back channels, making it clear that American support would depend on Britain's commitment to continue fighting even if the homeland fell. Roosevelt wanted assurance that the Royal Navy would be sent to dominions like Canada, Australia, and South Africa, rather than surrendered to Hitler. Churchill's speech threading this needle perfectly. He satisfied American concerns about British determination, while avoiding any hint to his own people that defeat was even being considered. This wasn't just political skill, this was leadership operating on multiple levels simultaneously, managing domestic morale, international relations, and military strategy, all within a single address. But the real test of Churchill's leadership was yet to come. By July 1940, Hitler had turned his attention to Britain with Operation Eagle, the air campaign that would become known as the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe possessed over 2,600 aircraft, compared to the RAF's 700 fighters. German pilots were battle-hardened veterans from campaigns across Europe. British pilots were brave, but many were barely out of training school. Churchill understood that this battle would determine everything. If Germany gained air superiority over Britain, invasion would follow within weeks. There would be no Dunkirk-style escape this time. This was it. Britain's final stand. On June 18th, as French resistance was crumbling and German bombers were already probing British defenses, Churchill delivered another speech that captured the stakes perfectly. "The Battle of France is over," he told Parliament. "I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle hangs the survival of Christian civilization. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" Notice what Churchill did here. He acknowledged the desperate reality, while simultaneously elevating the struggle to something transcendent. This wasn't just about Britain surviving. This was about whether democratic values and human freedom would endure. He was giving his people a cause worth dying for that was bigger than themselves. Throughout the summer of 1940, Churchill threw himself into the battle with an energy that astonished everyone around him. Despite being 65 years old, he was working 18-hour days, visiting fighter stations, inspecting coastal defenses, and personally monitoring every aspect of Britain's defense. He would appear at RAF command centers during air battles, watching the plotting boards as squadrons scrambled to intercept German formations. His presence wasn't just symbolic. Churchill had become Britain's first Minister of Defense, deliberately placing himself at the operational heart of the war machine. He met daily with military chiefs, questioned strategy, and made himself available for consultation at all hours. His staff complained about his demanding schedule and explosive temper, but they also recognized that he was driving himself harder than anyone else. The turning point came on August 20th, 1940, when Churchill delivered perhaps his most memorable line about the Battle of Britain. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. He was speaking about the RAF pilots who were literally saving Britain every single day, often flying multiple sorties against overwhelming odds. But Churchill's words carried deeper meaning. He was acknowledging that democracy's survival depended on individual heroism. These young pilots, many of them barely 20 years old, were holding the line not just for Britain, but for the entire concept of free society. Churchill understood that leadership sometimes means recognizing when others are carrying the heaviest burden and ensuring they know their sacrifice is seen and valued. The German strategy shifted dramatically on September 7th, 1940. After weeks of attacking RAF airfields and nearly bringing fighter command to its breaking point, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to begin bombing London instead. This decision, prompted partly by Churchill's retaliatory raid on Berlin after German bombers accidentally hit London, proved to be one of the war's crucial turning points. Churchill immediately recognized the opportunity. While London burned, RAF airfields could recover. Fighter command could rebuild its strength. The Blitz, horrific as it was for London civilians, had actually saved the Royal Air Force from potential defeat. But Churchill also understood that his role as a leader was now changing. During the Battle of Britain, he had been the strategic coordinator, working behind the scenes to manage Britain's defense. During the Blitz, he became the visible symbol of British defiance. Night after night, as German bombers pounded London, Churchill would emerge from underground shelters to walk among the ruins, cigar in hand, giving his famous V for victory sign. These weren't photo opportunities or political stunts. Churchill genuinely shared the dangers faced by ordinary Londoners. He refused to retreat to secure locations outside the capital. When Buckingham Palace was bombed, he was there. When the Houses of Parliament were hit, he surveyed the damage personally. When working-class neighborhoods in the East End were devastated, Churchill walked through the rubble, talking to families who had lost everything. The psychological impact was enormous. Here was the Prime Minister, the man responsible for the entire nation's survival, choosing to face the same risks as everyone else. Workers cheered him during visits to bombed cities like Plymouth and Coventry. His presence said more than any speech could, "We are all in this together, and we will endure whatever comes." By October 1940, something remarkable had happened. The same Conservative Party colleagues who had been skeptical of Churchill's appointment were now solidly behind him. His succession as party leader became a formality. Public opinion polls, still in their early stages, showed approval ratings that never dropped below 78% throughout the war. But Churchill's greatest challenge was still ahead. By 1942, what many historians now consider Britain's actual darkest hour, military disasters were mounting faster than victories. Singapore fell to the Japanese with 33,000 British prisoners taken. Tobruk was lost to Rommel's Afrika Korps. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. For the first time since becoming Prime Minister, Churchill faced serious political opposition at home. 2 votes of no confidence were brought against him in the House of Commons. A motion of censure was introduced after the fall of Tobruk, though Churchill survived it decisively with 475 votes to just 25. But the political atmosphere was changing. People were beginning to whisper that perhaps the old lion was past his prime, that maybe Britain needed fresh leadership for this global war. This was Churchill's true test of character. In 1940, he had been the voice of defiance when defiance was what Britain needed most. Now, in 1942, he had to prove he could adapt his leadership style to handle not just inspiring rhetoric, but the grinding complexity of managing a world war on multiple fronts simultaneously. The romantic phase of standing alone against Nazi Germany was over. Now came the much harder task of coordinating with difficult allies, managing competing priorities, and maintaining public support through a series of humiliating defeats. The pressure was unlike anything Churchill had faced before. Stalin was demanding a second front in Europe immediately, threatening to make a separate peace with Germany if Britain and America didn't invade Western Europe in 1942. American military leaders were pushing the same strategy, arguing that only a direct assault on Nazi-occupied France could relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. Churchill knew this was military suicide. British and American forces weren't ready for such an operation. The casualties would be catastrophic, and failure would end any hope of eventual victory. But opposing both Stalin and his most important ally required diplomatic skills that went far beyond stirring speeches. Churchill had to convince Franklin Roosevelt that the Mediterranean strategy, attacking through North Africa and Italy first, made more military sense than a premature cross-channel invasion. This meant countless hours of private negotiations, technical military discussions, and delicate relationship management with leaders who held Britain's fate in their hands. The personal strain was enormous. Churchill was now nearly 68 years old, working around the clock, traveling constantly to meet with Allied leaders, and bearing responsibility for decisions that affected millions of lives. His staff noticed that his famous energy was beginning to show cracks. He could still be demanding and explosive, but there were moments of doubt that hadn't existed during the heroic summer of 1940. What's remarkable is how Churchill adapted his communication strategy during this period. The soaring rhetoric that had worked perfectly during the Battle of Britain wasn't appropriate for the grinding campaign in North Africa or the complex negotiations with allies. Instead, Churchill began focusing on what he called the end of the beginning. Rather than promising immediate victory, he started preparing the British people for a long, difficult struggle that would require different kinds of sacrifice. His speech after the victory at El Alamein in November 1942 perfectly captured this evolution. "This is not the end," Churchill told the nation. "It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." He was acknowledging that Britain had finally stopped losing and started winning, but he wasn't overselling what this meant. There were still years of fighting ahead, still enormous challenges to overcome. This shift revealed something crucial about Churchill's leadership philosophy. He understood that different moments required different approaches. The desperate defiance of 1940 had been perfect for rallying a nation under immediate threat. The measured optimism of 1942 was better suited to sustaining morale during a protracted global conflict. Churchill was proving that great leaders don't just have one style they stick to regardless of circumstances. They adapt their methods to match what their people need at each specific moment. The formation of the Grand Alliance between Britain, America, and the Soviet Union showcased another dimension of Churchill's leadership. Managing the relationship between Roosevelt and Stalin required extraordinary diplomatic skill. These were two leaders with completely different worldviews, governing systems that were fundamentally opposed to each other and competing visions for the post-war world. Churchill positioned himself as the bridge between American democracy and Soviet communism. He could speak Roosevelt's language about democratic values and human freedom. He could also engage with Stalin's brutal pragmatism about spheres of influence and power politics. This wasn't just about military coordination during wartime. Churchill was already thinking about how to structure the peace that would follow victory. The Tehran Conference in 1943 demonstrated Churchill's strategic thinking at its most sophisticated. While Roosevelt and Stalin discussed their grand visions for reshaping the world, Churchill focused on practical questions about how to actually win the war first. He understood that all the post-war planning would be meaningless if the Allies lost the military conflict. But Churchill also recognized that his role in the Grand Alliance was changing as the war progressed. In 1940 and 1941, Britain had been the senior partner, the experienced democracy fighting for its survival. By 1943 and 1944, America and the Soviet Union were contributing far more resources to the war effort. Churchill had to maintain British influence and protect British interests, while acknowledging this shift in relative power. This required a completely different kind of leadership than the heroic defiance of the early war years. Now, Churchill had to be a negotiator, a strategist, and a diplomat all at once. He had to think several moves ahead, considering not just how to win the current battle, but how to position Britain for the peace that would follow. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 represented the culmination of Churchill's strategic patience. For 2 years, he had resisted pressure from Stalin and American military leaders to launch a premature invasion of Western Europe. He had insisted on the Mediterranean strategy first, building up Allied strength and gaining experience in North Africa and Italy before attempting the most difficult military operation in history. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Churchill's strategic vision was finally vindicated. The invasion succeeded because the Allies had spent those 2 years building overwhelming superiority in men, equipment, and air power. The patient approach that had been criticized as timid or overly cautious proved to be exactly the right strategy. But even in this moment of triumph, Churchill was already thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. He understood that military victory over Germany was now inevitable, but he was increasingly concerned about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. While celebrating the success of D-Day with his military commanders and Allied partners, Churchill was privately worrying about whether Stalin could be trusted to honor agreements about Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the other countries the Red Army was liberating from Nazi occupation thinking. This forewar perspective revealed another crucial aspect of Churchill's leadership. He never allowed immediate success to blind him to future challenges. Even as Allied armies were racing across France toward Germany, Churchill was already planning for the next phase of international relations. He understood that winning the war was only half the battle. The peace that followed would determine whether the sacrifices of the war years had been worthwhile. The contrast between Churchill's public confidence and his private concerns during this period shows the complexity of wartime leadership. Publicly, he continued to project absolute certain victory ante about Allied, the righteousness of the cause. Privately, he was wrestling with increasingly difficult questions about how to preserve democratic values in a world where Soviet power was expanding rapidly. Churchill's relationship with his own military commanders also evolved significantly during the later war years. In 1940, he had been hands-on to the point of micromanagement, personally involving himself in tactical decisions and operational planning. By 1944, he had learned to delegate more effectively while still maintaining strategic oversight. This wasn't just about Churchill becoming less controlling. It reflected his growing confidence in the British military system and his recognition that the war had grown too complex for any single person to manage every detail. Churchill had built a team of capable commanders and staff officers who could execute his strategic vision without constant supervision. The relationship with Field Marshal Montgomery, the commander of British forces in Normandy, exemplified this evolution. Montgomery was famously difficult to work with, demanding complete independence in tactical matters and frequently clashing with American commanders. Churchill learned to manage Montgomery's ego and eccentricities while using his undeniable military talents effectively. But Churchill also understood that his role as a wartime leader extended beyond military strategy and international diplomacy. He had to maintain the morale and unity of the British people through years of rationing, bombing, and uncertainty about when the war would end. His Christmas broadcasts became annual events that families across Britain gathered to hear. These weren't just updates on military progress. They were carefully crafted messages designed to sustain hope during the darkest periods and maintain perspective during moments of success. Churchill understood that leadership sometimes means helping people endure long periods of difficulty without losing sight of ultimate objectives. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps in 1945 confronted Churchill with horrors that even his wartime experience hadn't prepared him for. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims revealed the true nature of the enemy Britain fighting. Churchill had always been framed the war in moral terms, as a struggle between civilization and barbarism. The Holocaust proved that his moral framework had been not just rhetorically powerful, but literally accurate. Churchill's response to these revelations showed his leadership at its most profound. Rather than expressing shock or surprise, he treated the Holocaust as confirmation of what he had always believed about Nazi ideology. This wasn't just evil governance or military aggression. This was an assault on the fundamental concept of human dignity that required total defeat. As the war in Europe drew to its close in the spring of 1945, Churchill faced perhaps his most difficult leadership challenge yet. Victory was, but the alliance now certain with the Soviet Union was already showing dangerous cracks. Stalin was installing communist governments in Poland and other Eastern European countries, violating the agreements made at Yalta about free elections and democratic governance. Churchill had to balance celebrating the approaching end of the war with warning about new threats on the horizon. This required extraordinary political judgment, pushed too hard against Stalin too early, and he risked breaking the Grand Alliance before Germany was completely defeated. But wait too long to address Soviet expansion, and democratic Europe might find itself facing a new form of totalitarianism. The curtain speech Iron Churchill would deliver in Fulton, Missouri in 1946 was already taking shape in his mind during the final months of the war. But as Prime Minister, he had to be more diplomatic in his public statements, while privately preparing Britain and America for the possibility that their Soviet ally might become their next adversary. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Churchill appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with the royal family to acknowledge the cheering crowds below. After 5 years of leading Britain through its greatest trial, he had achieved what many thought impossible. Nazi Germany was defeated, democracy had survived. The British Empire, though changed forever, remained intact. But even this moment of ultimate triumph, Churchill understood that his work as a wartime leader was ending just as new challenges were beginning. The peace would require different skills and different approaches than the war had demanded. Whether Churchill would be the right leader for that next phase remained to be seen. What happened next reveals something profound about democratic leadership and the cruel ironies of history. Just 2 months after celebrating Victory in Europe Day, Churchill faced the British electorate in the general election of July 1945. The same people who had cheered him on VE Day delivered a crushing verdict at the ballot box. The Labour Party won by a landslide, securing 393 seats to the Conservatives' 213. Churchill, the man who had saved Britain and arguably Western civilization itself, was unceremoniously thrown out of office. The timing couldn't have been more brutal or more symbolic. Churchill had led Britain through the European War to complete victory, but he would watch Japan surrender from the political sidelines as Clement Attlee's government concluded the final chapter of World War II. The greatest wartime leader in British history had become, in his own words, a spectator at the moment of ultimate triumph. This electoral defeat reveals something crucial about the nature of democratic leadership that many people misunderstand. Churchill hadn't failed as a leader. He had succeeded so completely that the British people felt safe enough to choose different priorities for peacetime. They wanted social reform, economic reconstruction, and the creation of a welfare state. They associated Churchill with war, struggle, and international crisis. For a nation exhausted by 6 years of conflict, that association had become a political liability rather than an asset. But this apparent rejection actually validated everything Churchill had fought for. The fact that British voters could freely choose to dismiss their wartime hero proved that democracy had not just survived, but flourished under his leadership. In totalitarian societies, successful war leaders become dictators for life. In Britain, they get voted out when the people decide they want something different. Churchill understood this paradox better than anyone. His response to electoral defeat demonstrated the same character traits that had made him an extraordinary wartime leader. There was no bitterness, no attempt to cling to power, no suggestion that the voters had made a mistake. Instead, Churchill accepted the verdict with dignity and immediately began preparing for his new role as leader of the opposition. The man who had defied Hitler would now hold his own government accountable through parliamentary democracy. This transition illuminates the deepest lesson of Churchill's wartime leadership. His greatest achievement wasn't winning battles or inspiring speeches, though he did both brilliantly. His greatest achievement was preserving the democratic system that could reject him when the crisis passed. He had fought not to become indispensable, but to ensure that Britain remained a country where no leader needed to be indispensable. The years immediately following 1945 would prove Churchill's strategic vision once again. His warnings about Soviet expansion, dismissed by many as warmongering from a man who couldn't adapt to peace, proved prescient as the Cold War developed. The Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, the formation of NATO, and the recognition that Western democracies faced a new existential threat all flowed from Churchill's ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to longer-term challenges. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Churchill's legacy lies in how he redefined what leadership could mean during humanity's darkest moments. He proved that authenticity doesn't require perfection, that inspiration can coexist with brutal honesty, and that moral clarity can guide practical decision-making even under impossible pressure. Churchill's wartime leadership offers timeless lessons that extend far beyond military strategy or political maneuvering. He showed that great leaders don't just react to crises, they shape how their people understand and respond to those crises. He demonstrated that communication isn't just about delivering information, it's about helping people find meaning and purpose during periods of suffering and uncertainty. Most importantly, Churchill proved that democratic values aren't just pleasant ideals for peaceful times. They're worth defending even when defense seems hopeless, worth preserving even at enormous cost, and worth fighting for even when victory appears impossible. His leadership during Britain's darkest hours illuminated the fundamental truth that some things are more important than survival itself. The measure of Churchill's leadership ultimately lies not in the battles he won or the speeches he delivered, but in the world he helped preserve for future generations. Because of his refusal to surrender when surrender seemed rational, because of his ability to inspire hope when hope seemed foolish, because of his unwavering belief that democratic civilization was worth any sacrifice, we live in a world where freedom remains possible. That is the true legacy of Winston Churchill's leadership in the darkest hours. Not just that he helped Britain survive, but that he helped democracy itself endure its greatest test and emerge stronger than before. So what can we learn from this extraordinary man who transformed Britain's darkest hour into its finest hour? Churchill's leadership wasn't about having all the answers or never showing doubt. It was about something far more powerful and far more human. He showed us that authentic leadership means telling people the brutal truth while simultaneously giving them unshakable reasons to hope. He proved that great communicators aren't born. They're forged through relentless practice and an absolute commitment to connecting with their audience. Most importantly, Churchill demonstrated that when everything seems lost, when the rational choice is surrender, that's precisely when character matters most. His legacy isn't just about winning a war, it's about proving that democratic values can survive their ultimate test, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when properly led, and that sometimes one person's refusal to give up can literally change the course of human history. The next time you face your own impossible moment, your own darkest hour, remember the 5-year-old man with a cigar who looked at Nazi Germany's unstoppable war machine and said simply, "We shall never surrender." Because in the end, that's what leadership really is. Not avoiding the storm, but learning to dance in the rain until the sun breaks through. Churchill didn't just save Britain, he saved the idea that freedom is worth fighting for, no matter the odds.